I've been occupying this seat long enough that I've stopped measuring time in years and started measuring it in faces. The ones who arrived full of fire and left humbled by something they hadn't expected. The ones who walked in shattered and departed carrying something they hadn't come looking for. A sliver of self-worth, maybe, a hard truth. And every so often, the ones who still cross my mind during the drive home. Now, I want to be precise about something because this is not a story about a troubled kid. I don't subscribe to that idea. I've sat face to face with thousands of young people inside these walls, and I can say with complete honesty that I have never encountered a child who was simply wired for cruelty from birth. What I have encountered, more times than I'd like to admit, are children who were let down. Let down by their circumstances, let down by absent figures, let down by adults who were too damaged or too exhausted or too scared to do the uncomfortable work of raising them. Marcus Webb was one of those children, and what unfolded the morning he stepped into my courtroom, what was spoken, what was felt, and what quietly changed over 10 consecutive Saturdays in a backyard garden, that is a story that deserves to be told carefully, so let me tell it carefully. A boy with 40,000 subscribers and nobody to answer to. Marcus Webb was 13 years old, and by every standard that mattered to him, he had made it. He had 40,000 subscribers on YouTube, built entirely on content that ridiculed authority figures, celebrated rule-breaking, and turned defiance into a performance. His edits were clean. He understood comedic timing. He knew what resonated with an audience, and in a different environment with different mentorship, that instinct could have become something real, but nobody was shaping it. His mother, Diane Webb, was an office administrator who had been through a separation 2 years prior and was still quietly rebuilding herself inside the silence that divorce leaves behind. I'm not here to speak harshly about Diane. Separation dismantles a person in ways that take years to reassemble, and raising a child alone is among the loneliest things a human being can do. But somewhere inside all that wreckage, Diane had stopped functioning as Marcus's parent and started functioning as his shield, his defender against a world she believed was perpetually misreading her son. When Marcus was disrespectful to teachers, Diane questioned the school. When he was suspended 3 times across 18 months, she told people the administration didn't know how to handle strong-willed kids. When neighbors knocked on her door, she offered vague apologies and returned inside and changed nothing. She had quietly settled with 2 separate families over the previous 2 years, paying out just over $5,000 in total to keep incidents from escalating into formal complaints. She believed she was protecting him. What she was actually doing was teaching him that consequences were negotiable. The warning signals had been there. A school counselor had recommended outside intervention. 2 teachers had submitted written reports describing a pattern of behavior that went beyond ordinary mischief, a tendency to target people who appeared vulnerable. Diane had read those reports and placed them somewhere she wouldn't have to think about them because responding would have meant becoming the person her son resented, and she was terrified of that. I understand that fear. I've seen it in many parents who sat where she sat, but I also know exactly where it leads. Now let me tell you about Margaret Okafor, because Margaret deserves to be known. 74 years old, retired elementary school librarian, 28 years helping children find the right book at the right moment, which, I assure you, is more demanding work than people imagine. She had emigrated from Nigeria as a young woman and spent 5 decades quietly building a life on this soil. Her English was precise and musical, carrying within it the cadence of where she came from, something she wore without apology and everything to take pride in. Her husband, Charles Okafor, had passed away from a stroke 4 years before any of this reached my desk. They had been married for 37 years. Charles was the kind of man who, the week he moved into a home, would go out and plant something in the yard, not because he had hours to spare, but because he believed a home should have something alive growing near it. He had put in the first plantings in 1986, working by hand in soil he hadn't fully learned yet. Over nearly 4 decades, what had begun as a modest corner of greenery had grown into something genuinely remarkable. Rare cultivars he had sourced from specialty growers, colors that seemed to push against the limits of what plants were supposed to produce. Deep burgundy, shading into violet, creamy whites edged with the faintest gold at the petal tips. Professional botanists had approached him about purchasing specimens. Charles always smiled and declined. "You don't sell what love grew." After Charles died, Margaret continued tending the garden the way she had continued everything else, with structure, with devotion, and with the steady conviction that maintaining what he had built was a way of remaining in conversation with him. Every morning at 6, she brewed her tea, changed into her garden clothes, and spent the early hours pruning, watering, speaking to Charles, the way you speak to someone who is still somehow nearby. Her neighbors understood not to visit before 9. Those were Margaret's hours, protected and irreplaceable. Several of the plants had been brought from her family's compound in Lagos, cuttings her grandmother had kept, connecting Margaret not just to Charles but to her own roots, to soil on another continent that had shaped who she became. When I consider what Marcus Webb destroyed that night, I don't think in terms of monetary value. I think about all of that layered history, rooted in a single modest backyard. Marcus and Diane had moved in 2 doors down roughly 14 months before the case arrived on my desk. The early friction was unremarkable. Ordinary noise, ordinary boundary testing. Margaret understood children. She had spent nearly 3 decades with them. She was patient. But Marcus operated on a pattern: escalation. Every limit he discovered was simply a platform for the next one, and nobody was bringing him back. It began with a basketball thrown repeatedly against her rear fence during her morning hours. When she gently asked whether he might shift his playing to the afternoon, he looked at her for a long beat and threw it harder. Then came the litter, garbage tossed over the fence onto her beds. She approached Diane. Diane apologized. Nothing changed. Then Marcus found her accent. He filmed her through gaps in the fence without her awareness, from an upstairs window from angles she couldn't detect, catching moments when she was speaking to herself or humming softly, the way people do when they believe they're alone. He posted these clips with captions like "My unhinged neighbor" and "Why do old people act like this?" The comments filled with laughing reactions. Margaret Okafor, who had spent decades helping children find language, had spent years tutoring immigrant families in reading comprehension, found herself being mocked for an accent she had never once been ashamed of, by a child who had never been required to work at anything in his life. She returned to Diane. Diane apologized again. Marcus uploaded another video the following week. What happened next was not a prank. I want to establish that clearly, because Diane would reach for that word repeatedly in my courtroom, and I would redirect her every time. What Marcus did was a criminal act, deliberate, planned in advance, documented on video for the purpose of entertainment. Margaret woke at 6, as always, made her tea, put on her garden clothes, an old canvas jacket of Charles's she had kept because she couldn't let it go. She stepped through the back door into the morning air. Her plants were dead, not wilting, not struggling, dead, the way vegetation dies when something catastrophic has been introduced overnight, blackened at the stems, collapsed at the blooms, the soil around them discolored. Someone had applied concentrated commercial herbicide to every plant, methodically, completely, making certain that nothing would survive. She knelt in the soil and wept, not the restrained grief of someone who has learned to hold themselves together, the open, collapsing grief of someone whose last physical connection to the person they loved most had just been deliberately severed. Her niece found her there 40 minutes later. She might never have known who was responsible. Except Marcus posted the footage the following morning. He had filmed himself climbing the fence, narrating throughout in an upbeat commentary style, pointing out which plants he was targeting, laughing about how Margaret would react when she found them. He captioned it, "Getting back at my annoying neighbor." Old people are so easy to mess with. 40,000 people watched it. 4 who knew Margaret sent her the screenshots. When Margaret Okafor showed me that recording, when I watched a 13-year-old laugh his way through the deliberate annihilation of a widow's garden, narrating his own cruelty like it was content, I felt something I don't frequently permit myself on this bench: real anger, quiet and measured, but anger. Margaret had never pursued legal action in her life. Charles had always resolved conflict through dialogue, patient, steady, seeking common ground. She had carried that approach with her for 7 decades, but this was different. Marcus had committed a crime, filmed it, published it publicly, and his mother had done nothing. She filed a police report. Juvenile probation became involved. She also filed in small claims court seeking $18,600 for the destroyed plantings and $750 for emotional distress, a figure 3 horticultural experts told her substantially underrepresented her actual loss. Root systems built over 38 years cannot be replicated by nursery purchases. Specimens Charles had cultivated from cuttings across decades were genuinely irreplaceable. You could acquire new plants. You could not recover 38 years. She filed for what seemed reasonable. What Margaret didn't know was what happened once my review team became involved. When Marcus Webb's name landed on my desk, something in the file gave me pause, and I asked my team to look further. What they found was not a single incident. It was a documented pattern. The 2 prior settlements Diane had paid to keep quiet, the school records, the counselor evaluations, the intervention recommendations from 18 months earlier that had gone unaddressed. A young man in genuine trouble who had been buffered at every turn from the accountability that might have changed his direction. I spent 2 evenings reading through that file in full. I entered my courtroom the morning of Marcus Webb's hearing carrying something I don't often carry in with me. Not performed gravity, actual anger. The kind that arrives from watching a sequence of avoidable harm and recognizing that it didn't have to go this far. That somewhere in the chain someone should have held the line. Margaret entered first, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints have spent decades in garden soil. She wore a modest wrap dress she had owned for years, still immaculate. Her niece walked alongside her carrying the evidence, before and after photographs, still frames from Marcus's video, statements from horticultural consultants, and a small worn photograph of Charles kneeling in the soil in 1986, pressing the first roots into ground. She brought it because she wanted me to understand the full weight of what had been lost. I looked at it for a long moment. I understood. Then Marcus and Diane Webb came through the doors, and the room shifted. Marcus moved through the space the way certain teenagers move through places where accountability doesn't feel like it applies to them, as though the usual gravity had made an exception. Headphones on, phone at eye level, scrolling. He didn't acknowledge the bailiff. He didn't look at Margaret sitting 20 feet away. He found his chair and lowered himself into it with the boneless ease of someone who had nothing to answer for. Diane followed just behind, whispering close to his shoulder, reaching for some semblance of parental authority. Marcus shrugged her off each time without glancing at her. I watched all of it quietly. I've been doing this work long enough to read a room. What I read was a young man who had never been required to take anything seriously, and a mother who no longer believed she had the standing to require it. I called the proceedings to order and invited Mrs. Okafor to speak. She began steadily. Her voice held through the early portions, broke slightly when she reached the morning she stepped outside and found the garden. She presented the photographs, the before images, extraordinary specimens tended over decades of loving attention, the after images, blackened stems, collapsed petals, soil ruined with chemical. She played Marcus's video on the monitor. The room went quiet in a particular way. Throughout her testimony, Marcus sat with one earbud still in. He rolled his eyes when her voice wavered. He exhaled audibly when she described Charles pressing the first roots into soil by hand. The microphone near the defense table caught what he muttered. It sounded like so overdramatic. His mother closed her eyes. I noted all of it. I asked Marcus to put the phone away. He complied with the exaggerated slowness of a teenager performing reluctant cooperation, phone sliding into the pocket with movements calibrated to communicate contempt through the smallest possible action. One earbud removed, one left dangling, a deliberate minor defiance. I noted that too. Diane began her defense. Marcus was fundamentally a good kid who had made a terrible error in judgment. Mrs. Okafor was overstating the significance. At the end of the day, plants were plants, replaceable. Marcus was only 13. His understanding of consequences was still developing. Social media had warped his sense of what crossed a line. She had spoken with him seriously at home. They had real conversations about respect. I listened to all of it. Then I told her directly, at 13, children understand the difference between right and wrong. Her son had not stumbled into this accidentally. He had conceived of it, carried it out, filmed it, published it for a public audience, and laughed about reducing an elderly woman to tears. This was not a social media literacy problem. This was cruelty executed in front of an audience. I turned to Marcus and asked whether he understood that what he had done was wrong. He met my eyes with the expression of someone being asked to explain something they find slightly beneath them. I mean, he said, they're literally just plants. She can get more. It's not that serious. The courtroom stilled. That particular silence when a room full of people cannot process what they've just heard and is holding its breath to see what follows. I said, "Not that serious. You destroyed something irreplaceable, and it's not that serious." And Marcus Webb, emboldened by 13 years of consequences that had dissolved before ever reaching him, looked at me with mild impatience and said, "Whatever, adults are so sensitive about everything." He glanced faintly toward the camera, already writing the caption in his head. I looked at him for a long moment. What I've learned over many years on this bench is that the most important thing you can do in a moment like that is not react immediately. Let the silence occupy the space. Let the room feel the weight of what's been said, and then when you speak, mean every word. I told him, "You are 13 years old, and you are already on a course toward becoming someone nobody chooses to be near." I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because it is true and because you need someone in your life willing to tell you the truth. Your mother loves you. I can see that she does. But she has failed you by never teaching you that your actions carry weight, that they land on other people in real ways. That is not your failure. You didn't construct this situation, but you are the one who inhabits it, and you are the one who will have to rebuild from it. You believe your subscribers make you significant. They don't. They're watching you perform. The moment you stop being entertaining, they'll move on without a single thought. They don't know you. They don't care about you. And right now, the content is you causing harm to a 74-year-old woman who has never once done anything to you, who lost her husband, who enters that garden every morning because it is how she stays connected to someone she misses every single day. You believe that was amusing. I am here to tell you it was not. I then laid out what my team had uncovered. The 2 prior settlements Diane had paid quietly. The $5,000 spent making problems go away. The school documentation. The counselor evaluations. The intervention recommendations that had been left on a shelf. Every piece of it landed on Diane like something solid. She was seeing assembled in one place the full picture of what her approach had produced. Marcus had gone pale. The indifference had left his face entirely. I told him about the garden in detail. Charles pressing the first roots into soil in 1986. The cuttings Margaret had carried from her family home in Lagos. Her grandmother's plants, living connections to a country, to a lineage, to an origin. The assessment from the horticultural consultant. The dollar figure was a fraction of the actual loss. Some things, once they're gone, are simply gone. That is something you need to understand while you're still young enough for it to shape how you move through the world. I awarded Mrs. Okafor the full amount she had requested, but the financial judgment was the least significant part of what happened next. Marcus would personally restore Margaret Okafor's garden. 40 hours of physical labor across 10 consecutive Saturdays, supervised by a court-appointed mediator. No device permitted during any session. He would be physically present in the space he had destroyed, doing the work of rebuilding it. He would compose a formal written apology. No digital assistance, no guidance from his mother, his own words in his own handwriting. His YouTube channel would be permanently closed. All content featuring Mrs. Okafor removed immediately. He would be prohibited from all social platforms for 6 months, with court monitoring for compliance. Diane would enforce every condition or face contempt charges herself. I want to explain the reasoning because it matters. Marcus's identity, his sense of worth, his standing, his entire understanding of his own importance was anchored in that channel. Removing it wasn't punitive for the sake of inflicting pain. It was designed to force him to sit inside the silence where all the notifications used to be and discover whether there was anything underneath. And the garden work was designed to put him in front of Margaret Okafor, face to face, week after week, to do something for her instead of to her, to learn through physical effort what it means to care for something living. Marcus's response told me everything I needed to know. He cried, not about Margaret, not about what he'd taken from her, about the channel, about the subscriber count. That was the first genuine emotion he had shown throughout the entire proceeding. He said it wasn't fair, that I couldn't take it, that people cared about him. I said as quietly as I could, "Those aren't people who care about you. Those are people who watch you. There is a difference. You need to learn it." Diane was crying as well. She said she had only ever wanted Marcus to like her, that she never knew how to be the person who said no. I believed her. I told her so. But I also told her, he doesn't need you to be his companion. He needs you to be his parent. Those have never been the same thing. When Marcus attempted one final protest, voice unsteady, telling me I was out of touch, I gave him the last thing I had left to offer. "Sit down. Be quiet. You are going to spend 40 hours rebuilding what you destroyed. Use that time to sit with one idea. Respect is not something you collect because you have an audience. It is something you earn by showing it first, to people who are older, more worn down, and carrying more grief than you are capable of imagining yet. You earn it by showing up when no one is watching. Case dismissed. The recording circulated widely afterward, tens of millions of views. I understand why, and I think there can be genuine value in accountability being witnessed publicly. But the viral moment is not the story I most want to leave behind. The story I most want to tell is what happened over 10 Saturdays in Margaret Okafor's backyard. Marcus arrived the first morning with his eyes on the ground and the posture of someone who has never performed manual labor and has no interest in starting. They did not speak. He worked in silence. When he left, he said nothing. The second Saturday was the same. But Margaret noticed, because she had spent nearly 3 decades noticing things about young people that other adults had stopped paying attention to, that he was watching her, not the way he had watched her before, through a gap in the fence with a phone, simply watching, the way a person watches someone doing something they don't yet understand but are beginning to be curious about. On the third Saturday, he asked a small question, why she was cutting a branch at a particular angle. Margaret answered it the way she had answered questions for 30 years, completely, patiently, as though the question deserved a real and full response. Something shifted after that, not dramatically, the way things grow without your being able to observe it until one morning you notice how much has changed. He began arriving a few minutes before he needed to. He asked more questions. He listened with the focused attention of someone who has discovered there is more depth to something than they had assumed. Margaret began talking about the garden, not to press the weight of what he'd taken from her, but simply because he was present. And talking about Charles while she worked was what she had always done. She told him how she and Charles had met, about coming to a new country with almost nothing, about students she still thought about decades later. She told him what it means to carry something living across an ocean, how a plant can be a form of memory. Marcus listened. He had no phone to look at. He simply sat in the dirt and heard a 74-year-old woman tell him about her life. On the 6th Saturday, he asked if she would teach him a few words in Yoruba. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and said yes. On the 9th Saturday, he arrived with a small potted plant in a paper bag, nothing rare, a simple cutting he had selected at a nursery after asking the staff what might do well alongside what they were growing. She found a place for it that morning in a corner she had been leaving open without quite knowing why. On the final Saturday, when the mediator signed the completion documents and the court order was fulfilled, Marcus didn't leave immediately. He stayed an extra hour to finish a section he had started. When he finally gathered his things and stood at the gate, he turned to Margaret, not to the mediator, not to the space in general, and said he was sorry. Not the submitted written apology, carefully composed and technically sufficient. This was different, shorter. He just said, "I'm sorry. I didn't understand what I was doing." And he left. Margaret told me about that moment when I encountered her some months later at a community event. She was smiling. She told me she believed him. People ask what keeps me returning to this work after so many years. The cases are often draining. The stories are frequently painful. You witness a great deal of harm that didn't have to develop the way it did. A great deal of damage that could have been prevented if someone had made a different choice earlier in the sequence. But you also see this. A young person headed somewhere very wrong, turned around. A woman with every justification for bitterness, choosing patience instead. A garden coming back. I don't think of what occurred in my courtroom that day as a victory. Nobody walked away whole. Margaret Okafor lost specimens that Charles had grown over nearly 4 decades. No ruling, no apology, no number of Saturday hours returns that to her. She absorbed that reality with more grace than most people could find. What I believe happened, what I hope happened, is that Marcus Webb received a genuine chance. The kind that comes when someone finally respects you enough to tell you the truth and then requires you to sit with it in the dirt for 10 Saturdays without the comfort of an audience. He was 13. He had been failed by people who were supposed to guide him in ways he had not chosen. He had a long road ahead, but he was still young enough for the direction to change, still young enough for the lesson to take hold, slowly, without announcement, the way cuttings take hold until one morning you notice something is actually alive. What no bench can do and what no ruling can do is love a child into becoming someone better. That requires a person willing to be present in the garden with them, Saturday after Saturday, answering questions, correcting pronunciation, leaving room for one more small plant in a space that had somehow been waiting. Margaret Okafor did that. And I believe that matters more than anything I said from this bench.